This is a Film Stories original podcast.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second LTE internet plan with smartphone plan savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today it is my honor to be talking to Jonathan Rosenbaum, who is a legend amongst film critics. He is an author of several books, the latest of which is a collection of conversations with the Iranian critic and curator Ehsan
Khoshbakht.
So first of all, I wanted to ask how this book came about.
The way it came about basically was that Paul Cronenist translated an interview, a book-length interview with Michel Simon that had appeared in French already. Then I heard that he wanted to make it a series of book-length interviews with film critics, and he invited me to do one, and I agreed. And then I thought of asking Ehsan to be the one to interview me, actually. And once Ehsan agreed, then we were in business.
And you know Ehsan from a long time ago?
Yes. Well, I mean, when I was writing for the Chicago Reader, I used to get these emails right after some, a review of mine had, been posted online. He would email me from Iran, first of all, correcting all of the typos that he spotted, and also sending me better illustrations for the pieces than had been posted. So it kind of was amazing to me. So, I mean, he became my closest and most, resourceful reader in a way. So that's how we first became friends. After he had left Iran and had moved to London, I mean, we got to, I had suggested at one point that he attend the Il Cinema Retrovato in Bologna, which is the biggest film event of every year that I attend. And within a year from the time that he first went to Bologna for this event, he joined the staff. So it was very quick, actually.
And now he's the artistic director, right?
Well, I guess he qualifies as co-director. The main director is Jean-Luc, who's the director of the festival. But I guess you could say he's second in command. I don't know. I believe that's the way it works.
Yeah, I've met Ehsan at the Bologna and also Locarno, where he has been doing the retrospective there, I think, for 2 years.
Yes, and I wrote something for his catalog. When he was doing Columbia Pictures, I wrote about some André de Toth films, mainly westerns, that he did at Columbia.
It was a fascinating retrospective. One of the things I love about Locarno are the retrospectives. I think they're very much the highlight of that film festival.
He's picked figures that I would say are not exactly fashionable, but sort of like have been neglected. So I mean, it's been kind of interesting that way.
I think what's fascinating about the book is the way that, in the sense, it's an autobiography, but it also mirrors one of your most famous books as well, because there's a series of conversations. It reminded me very much of This Is Orson Welles, the collection of conversations between Orson Welles and Peter Bogdanovich, which you sort of put together. Obviously, in this case, you are one of the conversants.
Yes, I mean, of course, to be fair, This Is Orson Welles was already, to a large extent, pre-edited by, I think even more by Wells than by Bogdanovich, because when I was sent the existing manuscript, it was, sometimes numerous drafts of the same pages, but it was like Wells had rewritten them and often rewritten what Bogdanovich was supposed to have said as well as what he said. So in fact, when there was a piece that appeared in Esquire in response to Pauline Kael called The Caine Mutiny that was signed by Peter Bogdanovich, one of the first things I learned about after I met Oya Kadar at Rotterdam, when I said, when you see Peter, tell him I really like this, this piece. And she said, or that was written by Orson, not by Peter, actually. So, I mean, part of what's really impressive about that piece is it's how good it is as an impersonation of Peter. And in fact, when people claim that Wells couldn't write, it seems to me that his skill, and I mean, to me, anybody who reads The Big Brass Ring, which I had published, a script of Wells that he wasn't able to realize, I think it proves he was a great writer. But I think the fact that he was able to imitate Bogdanovich so well is another sign of how good he was as a writer.
Yeah, and just the fact that he's such a great storyteller, but at the same time he would go back and edit his own comments and his own copy so that it would be, that to me sounds like a writer.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I have to say that it's I've used, had, sort of like exchanges with other writers on several of my books. I mean, and, the afterword and the appendix of Midnight Movies is a dialogue between Jim Hoberman and myself. And then a book I did with Mernasai Vafa and Abbas Kiarostami. There's a lot of exchanges, not just interviews that we both had with Kiarostami, but dialogues between us about the films also. So it's a kind of methodology I've had for some time. And then there's also a book that I co-edited with Bill Crone, which appeared in Italian in France, but has not appeared in English, about Joe Dante and Roger Corman and so on. That actually also has a lot of interviews in it.
It's interesting, that dialogue as a form, as you say, as a methodology for sort of thinking, because as I was reading through the book, there seemed to be a repeated theme of you getting into groups and having dialogues, and how the community around you would help you or hinder you in terms of developing your own thought and your own writing and your own approach to film.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And in fact, I mean, one rule I've made for myself is that every time I'm invited to do an audio commentary on a DVD, I've insisted that it be a dialogue and not a monologue. I mean, there's only one single audio commentary I've done, just because I couldn't come up with anyone else, and that was when I was asked to do an audio commentary on The Turin Horse, Béla Tarr's film. And even there, I couldn't fill up the entire, film. It was like I talked for the first 45 minutes, but generally, I hate the idea of, I mean, one of the things that sort of poisons the whole atmosphere of film criticism to a certain extent is the whole notion of professionalism, which I think is a kind of a bogus idea. I mean, it seems to me some of the very best film critics in the world are not considered professionals, and many who are considered professionals aren't very good critics or don't know much about film. So the whole thing is kind of dubious. It's all about, I mean, and professionalism is based on, like whether people get paid and how much they get paid. And, it's the whole thing is kind of a boondoggle, I think. So, but I think at the same time, I see film criticism as a social activity. And it's changed over the years, because it used to be that, you'd see a film in one time frame, and then in the following time frame, you'd discuss it. But now it seems to me that what makes it social, before what made it social was the fact that you would all see the films together in the same room. Now it's like you see it maybe in different situations, and then you get together afterwards to discuss it, or you discuss it on the internet. But it seems to me that it's still social, and that and that I think that needs to be acknowledged, because the whole idea of, see, I think there's so many things about film criticism in general that are assumed and are not by everybody and are not true. For example, most people seem to think that it's possible to determine whether films are good or bad using both terms in quotes, when it seems to me, unless you're talking about who it's good for or what it's good for or bad for, it's a meaningless distinction.
Mm.
So and in fact, that's what seems to me so crazy, because it seems to me perfectly reasonable that a film that is good for me for various reasons, which I could list, may not be good for you. And the same thing with bad films. I mean, it's like there are too many intervening issues that are just ignored. And in the same kind of way, when people talk about things like, even though I participate, in 10 best lists, and people saying this was a good year for movies or a bad year for movies. That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard of, unless you've seen all the movies made in the world and been able to evaluate all of them. You can't even say that. It's like, it's ridiculous. And yet the arrogance of that is just partly a reflection of American, or the arrogance of large countries. It's
Mm.
like over small ones, that people think America equals the world, and that if you're not American, it either means you either want to be American or you hate America. But it's sort of like, it's not even considered a possibility that you might be non-American and not even have a position about America. It's sort of like America controls so many discourses that it even controls the discourses of what films are important. I mean, think of it like the Academy Awards and all the great films that don't even get considered for the Academy Award. I mean,
Absolutely.
the last great film I saw, which is Rob Tregenza's most, recent feature, The Fishing Place. It would be ridiculous to even imagine that it would ever get nominated for an Oscar. But it's still a film that's much better, to my mind, than any films that got Oscars this year. So the whole thing is kind of like, we haven't been able to distinguish in film criticism very readily between what's criticism and what's advertising. And that's for the convenience of the film industry. It's because the film industry polices criticism in a certain way.
I definitely feel that there are publicists breathing down your neck about things, and even editorially, you can't write on something unless there's a so-called peg in terms of a release or something that if a film has been, I mean, I love the bit in the book where it talks about you working for the Reader, and you could review something as long as it was in a cinema in Chicago. So you could review Pretty Woman weeks and weeks after it had been released because it was still in a cinema somewhere in Chicago. So it gave you some freedom to
even months. It was half a year after it was released I mean, I didn't take advantage of it as much as I could have, but you see, I think that one of the important things about this new book that makes it a landmark for me is that I've recently decided that it's a mistake for me to be involved with academic presses, because for several reasons. First of all, I've been exploited by film academia every time I've literally every time I've taught at an academic institution, at least in the U.S. I can't say that I was exploited at Film Factory in Sarajevo or at St. Andrews when I taught there in Scotland, but everywhere in the U.S., every time I've taught, I've been treated as an adjunct by people who know less about film than I do. And when it comes to, one of my most ambitious books, which came out last year, In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, a Jonathan Rosenbaum reader. This is a book that includes film criticism, literary criticism, and jazz criticism, or music criticism that's mainly jazz criticism. And because it deals with all three, it was rejected by two of the leading academic presses, even though in both cases, at both presses, the editors I submitted the manuscript to liked it and wanted to publish it. So it was very shocking for me to discover that not even the editors have the last word on manuscripts at academic presses. The publicists have the last word, which to me, that becomes such a boondoggle that if they get any sort of like state grants, they shouldn't. Because, I mean, why should they be getting state grants if what their purpose is in publishing books is to make money? I mean, it's like, so anyway, because of those experiences, and also in the case of University of California Press, they let me believe that they were going to be publishing the book for 3 or 4 months before they told me they weren't doing it, which I think was just outrageous, terrible behavior. And in fact, it wasn't true with this interview book, but I have a book coming out in May called Camera Movements That Confound Us. And this was a book that was commissioned by an academic press, but they asked for it. I was encouraged to make it experimental in its methodology. But after doing that, there were all sorts of objections and requests for revisions. And I tried to do some of them, but then I got more criticisms and asked for more changes. And I decided, because I had an offer from Sticking Place Books, that they could take over and pay the same amount of advance that I switched publishers in midstream. Right. So I'm grateful to actually Fordham University Press for having been responsible for me thinking up the idea for the Camera Movements book. But in fact, even though I'm very grateful to the editors there who helped me along in various ways, Erica Balsam and Genevieve Yu, but nonetheless, it's not only was I able to get to publish the book as I wanted to do it with Sticking Place Books, they're bringing it out a year earlier because they're not constrained by the fact that academic press books in the U.S., unlike those in Europe, take at least a year, which is kind of ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't take a year to put out a book, but it takes academic presses a year because of the bureaucracy, I guess, and because of all the methodology of. I also, you have to submit to things like readers who hide their identity, which, I don't know. I feel like at 82, I'm a little too old to be playing these games, I almost feel like I'm open to criticism, I'm open to discussion, but at the same time, what I'm being asked to conform to by academic presses, often reactionary ideas, or at least plus the fact that I think this is more of an ideological thing that's happened to me, that from a very early age, I knew that I was a writer. And before I became a film critic, I really considered myself a literary writer. In a way, I've never stopped considering myself a literary writer. So I realized that in a certain kind of way, one of the problems I've been having with academic presses is that they have different values which are not literary values. That in fact, to make my books conform to what they want, I have to lose my voice, so it's like, so there's all the more reason why I'm happy to have switched publishers to Sticking Place Books.
I think that's really interesting. I also come from a literature point of view. I did my postgrad in Shelley and romantic poetry.
So in my case, you see, when I was in graduate school, which was really, in a way, I was draft dodging because it was during the war in Vietnam and I didn't want to be drafted. And I came from a state, Alabama, fortunately, where there were so many enlistments that I wasn't in as much danger about being drafted as I would have been, if I'd been born in New York, like my mother was, for example, right, or whatever. But then it wasn't even possible to get a degree in film criticism then, at least that I was aware of, because film studies were just getting started then. So I actually was in English and American Lit, and I did everything except my dissertation. And the reason why I didn't do my dissertation is I wanted it to be on film and literature, and I couldn't find anybody at the university that I was at, State University of New York at Stony Brook, who was willing to accept my idea of doing a dissertation that compared literature and film. So that's really why I didn't write a dissertation, because it's sort of like, so in a sense, my interests and the interests of film academia have always been at loggerheads from the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think In terms of the style, I mean, I'm very interested to hear what the experimental methodology was that you've gone for with this latest book.
Well, I guess part of it was I've always been a believer in mimetic criticism, which is, in other words, that whatever filmmaker you're writing about, that there's something that's in the style of how you write about it that is influenced by what you're writing about. And so I would say, since the topic, and it's really not a survey, because it's too big and unwieldy a subject, confounding camera movements. But the point is that I think I wanted to write confounding sentences, or
Right.
sentences that went in unexpected directions. That one way of trying to understand something is trying to imitate it. And so that's the main way. And I guess there's just other ways in which, because I was sort of like feeling already in conflict with certain academic ideas about what's academically correct, I wanted to make it academically incorrect. So, I mean, in some ways, for example, one of the things, I don't know if you can call this experimental, but even though it's a book that's about camera movements in films, I also deal with camera movements in the daily news on TV, and
Right.
also ideological aspects. In other words, if we really love certain kinds of very smooth tracking shots, if that has to do with a certain ideas about wealth and having access to these wealthy toys and tools and so on. So there are all kinds of aspects to my subject that would not normally, I guess, be considered, which I've tried to include in my book.
Does that mean like sort of a
So I guess
smooth?
that's
Does that mean sort of like a smoothness that you would get with, I don't know, Stanley Kubrick's Steadicam or Wes Anderson's sort of lateral panning?
yeah. And Alan Rene is a very important reference point. Yeah, and an interesting thing about Kubrick, for example, that I don't think it's been analyzed, and I don't go into detail about it, but one kind of camera movement that Kubrick does, and that you don't find elsewhere very much, is tracking shots that move outside a set, following characters inside a set. Like, for example, you might early on in The Killing, you have Sterling Hayden walk across all of his apartment from room to room, and the camera follows him from a distance outside the set.
Through
So
walls.
yeah, that's right. So that's a kind of I think and that's what partly becomes, you could say, what's confounding in a way, because there's a paradox, a paradox which actually is at one token of the way that Kubrick can kind of keep his distance from his characters, even when he's following them very closely, because his camera can do things that his characters can't do, can move in ways that his characters can't, for example.
Yeah, even the sort of the helicopter shot in The Shining following the car at the very beginning is a sort of like God's eye view that we need to stop people from imitating, because I've seen that shot now in every single horror movie that involves someone going into a forest.
Yeah. No, I know there's a certain kind of way in which, one of the things I try to explore in the camera movements book is camera movements that somehow have some relationship to, even if it's not clarified, to footsteps, or
Mm,
if it's not whether it's gliding, or if it's like, in other words, if the camera, and of course in The Shining it's different because the camera angle is lower, because of it's following the little boy who's, in that cart, sort of moving down the hallways.
yeah.
So it's yeah, I mean, I think I can't say that the book was sort of like done in a fairly intuitively, so it's not a systematic examination of the subject. I mean, I see it as a series of skirmishes into this topic,
Mm.
rather than as something that tries, to be definitive or exhaustive or anything like that. But it's experimental in the sense that I'm trying to see what writing can do, and trying to come to terms with things that are confounding, and that's what interests me about them, like in films.
I love the way a critic or a writer can come at something and not want to be confused, but be accept a degree of ambivalence or ambiguity, and they're not gonna. This is something that confuses me, and I'm not gonna jump to the answer. I'm just gonna think about that for a bit.
Yeah, It's one thing, in other words, movies that call attention to our own responses and what provokes them. I'm very grateful, by the way, to Genevieve Yu because once I started work on the Camera Movements book, she suggested I take a look at Inside the Yellow Cocoon Shell, a Vietnamese feature, which has got to be one of the greatest films, new films that I've seen in the last few years. And it's been available, both in the US and in Europe, but at the same time, it certainly doesn't have anything like mainstream recognition and is really a kind of an avant-garde film. And it's a first feature, which is even more impressive, involving a lot of very extensive camera movements, but camera movements that are not exactly that don't follow the rules that we usually associate with camera movements. Anyway, it was a perfect film for me to be wrestling with for this book, one of the films.
Throughout Travels in the Cities of Cinema, you have it's structured by these movements. You from city to city, from your home in Alabama to New York, and then Paris and London.
Yes.
I think that's one of the sort of an overriding theme as well in terms of your cinema. I mean, you've just mentioned the Vietnamese film for our listeners to now look up and discover this idea of, we want to open up the world of cinema to the world and not simply Hollywood and the 100 best films on the list or whatever, the canon. So you've had two journeys really.
That's partly a reflection even of my upbringing, because I think because I grew up on a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Alabama, there were a lot of interesting visitors from different parts of the world who would come by that for one reason or another. So I grew up being kind of fascinated by people from other cultures and other countries.
And you all also had access to all those cinemas as well. You had access to a bunch of cinemas that were your grandfather's.
Yes, and it was also during the period when, because of the separation of the studios from the theaters, because of the divestiture, that went on between the theater, that consequently there was a lot of that there were foreign films that were showing in my hometown. I mean, maybe not as many. When I first became interested in film as an art form was after I had basically moved to the north, to go to college and kind of stayed there. But at the same time, and it was also interesting that I find it fascinating that during the Cold War, and in particular the late 50s, early 60s, there was more openness to foreign points of view through cinema and through other things than there is today. I mean, it's shocking to me how, even though we have the resources of the internet, which, basically makes it possible for us to be in contact with people from all over the world. And in fact, one of the things that I like about my life is that, I have friends in Australia, I have more friends in Paris and London than I do in Chicago even, or in New York. In other words, my friends are kind of spread out around the world, but I'm in touch with them, and it's possible for me to be in touch with them on a more of a regular basis than I could, back in the 60s. And yet, this America is much more isolated. Of course, it's being isolated by our president right now from the rest of the world, quite brutally and disturbingly, of basically sort of but I think that there's a kind of a mystery for me about why there was more awareness of the rest of the world. I think there's a general problem, though, about the biggest countries. And by the biggest countries, I'm thinking of, China, Russia, India, the US. It's sort of like they tend to see themselves as the whole world, in each of them. Consequently, they don't have much space left for what really is the rest of the world. So it's like it's a general problem, I think, that people don't admit to this in the U.S., but it seems to me that a lot of Americans assume that if you're not American, it either means that you want to be American, where there's this whole idea that everybody wants to become American, and we have to discourage them, or you hate America and you want to destroy it. But the idea that you could be not American and indifferent to America doesn't even come up. It's like everything relates to being American, whereas it seems like that everything that happens in the world is not necessarily American. So it seems to me that there's a kind of, I mean, I have a brother living in London, my youngest brother, and the only one actually I grew up with three brothers, but only one is still alive. He thinks what's happening now is in some ways a good thing because he thinks that America does a lot of damage in the world, and America and what Trump is doing now is making U.S. more isolated and more power and less powerful, and he thinks that's a good thing because it means it can do less damage, which I can. Which makes a certain amount of sense to me.
I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about the looking at news camera movements and everything like that. When I was in China, when you have the introduction to the news, you have a sort of a globe turning around, and of course, growing up in England, the globe stops round about Great Britain. And now I live in Italy, the globe goes on a little bit further, and you get Italy. When I was in America, the globe goes round and it stops. And in China, I was watching the news, and the globe turned around and stopped with China in the middle, and you sort of think, oh wow, their globe doesn't seem to work. It's not going around to where to the center of the universe. And of course, as you were saying, the center of the universe is China. For China, it's the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah. So I think that there's a kind of way in which, I don't know, I think that there's a disadvantage to coming from one of these large countries for that reason, because oddly enough, I mean, I've just mentioned this in something I'm writing now, that to be worldly as an American in a way means to be more provincial. I mean, as paradoxical as that sounds, if you're worldly as an American, it means that you're thinking of your home turf. And this is spelled out in a kind of even alarming way by Vance. I mean, when he says basically he basically has set up the rules for all of us that he wants us to abide by, which was that we first care about our family, then we care about our country, then we care about and only then after that can we care about other countries. But I mean, that doesn't describe my own life or situation or emotionally or practically at all. I mean, I consider Paris my home now, not Florence, Alabama. And thank God I have those priorities, because if I thought Florence, Alabama was my home, I would, as far as my professional profile existed, would be nowhere. I have absolutely no professional status, worth mentioning in my hometown. But then on the other hand, I'm known to a fair number of people in Paris and New York and so on. So it's like, it seems to me that there are kind of all sorts of existential ways in which we can transcend our nationality. But the belief of people like Vance is not only that we should not do that, but that we should almost be forbidden from doing that, which is crazy, because when we're really talking about most alibis for patriotism, it really become business. So in other words, what I'm supposed to be interested in is how much money billionaires make when they don't even need to make more money. It's sort of like you don't even know, somehow I thought if what Trump and Elon Musk was doing was in order to build beautiful things, it might be more forgivable. But it's almost like we want more money than we have so we can build more ugly things and create more ugly institutions. So then it becomes completely intolerable. Why should I be interested? That's why, in a way, you see, an Academy Awards is a perfect example of, sort of the boondoggle, it's advertising, and yet we're supposed to accept it as, some kind of objective judgment of what are the best movies. But it's an organization that's run by the film industry, just like the ratings are run by the film industry. So, and in fact, one of the big differences between the American Film Institute and, say, the British Film Institute is that the British Film Institute is interested in films from all over the world. The American Film Institute is only interested in Hollywood, not only just in American films. When they originally had their original list of the 100 greatest American films, not one cast of, no independent films. Chaplin, when they did the 100 best comedies, Monsieur Verdoux couldn't be included because that's an independent film. It's not a Hollywood film. So the point is that it's like, but what I'm saying is that these kind of biases are so active in our institutions now that people don't even know to what extent they're being what they think is sort of the objective news is actually advertising. And in fact, what is the Academy Awards but reselling products that have already been sold again, making more money out of something that they've...
Absolutely. And then films also, in a strange way, become advertising for the Oscars, because I sometimes see the nominations
Yes.
and I sort of think, okay, I bet this one will win, not because this movie really needs an Oscar, but the Oscar really needs the credibility of awarding this movie.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think that there's an awful lot of unexamined assumptions that exist in the world of film criticism that I think need to be examined more closely.
It's one of those assumptions that you, when you were traveling and when you were, are there some assumptions that you've found yourself deconstructing or taking to pieces, or at a certain point you've gone, okay, no, I was wrong, for that half of my career, and this was a particular bias that I'd somehow breathed in with the culture and with the oxygen?
Well, yes, the first book I did, which is actually my most literary work, actually, Life Movies, is James Nairnford, academic film critic. He basically, I was trying to connect the fact that I grew up in a family of exhibitors with the fact that I later became a film critic, when in fact, before I wrote that book, those were two parts of my life that weren't exactly connected, which seemed crazy, but it was, so there was a personal drive behind, my writing in the book, because it was trying to connect parts of my life that were disconnected.
Mm, mm.
And then to me, one sort of definition I have of sort of like, I guess you could say experimental art of different kinds is to make content that has previously been unavailable available. In other words, it's in order to express something that hasn't been expressed, you sometimes need to change the methodology of the writing or whatever, and in a sense that when I do things that are experimental, it's really to get at things that I couldn't get at otherwise.
And so you see that also you also have a great love for jazz, which comes through in the book. And Ehsan,
Yes.
I know, is a huge jazz fan.
Yes, that was part of the basis of our friendship in a way, because at the time, I mean, he became particularly interested in, like I reviewed a lot of jazz films when I worked for the British Film Institute, and was, reviewing a lot of jazz films for Monthly Film Bulletin. So, yeah, and I think in a way that's been part of the basis behind our friendship from the beginning, the fact that we have this interest in both film and jazz. And we've even done programmed jazz films together, which we've done. We've presented programs of jazz films in Turkey, actually, and we also did, done some in Bologna.
What would be an example of a film that for you synchronizes or synthesizes jazz and cinema best?
Well, the best example in a way is the last piece in my book that came out last year, in Dreams Begin Responsibilities, because the last piece is one of my favorite works of jazz, even though it doesn't have any improvisation, is an hour-long big band piece for, it's called a jazz cantata, that composed by André with two singers, one alto and one soprano, that uses a text from Finnegan's Wake called Anna Livia Pluribel. And because a performance of that work is available on YouTube, and so everybody can access it, it was my way of dealing in the final piece in the book, written especially for the book, a film of a jazz work that's derived from literature. So in other words, that all three art forms are intermingling and doing things for each other in ways that I try to analyze. So, and these have been sort of like lifelong. I mean, one of the great discoveries I made when putting together in Dreams Begin Responsibilities, was just how much that I've been comparing literature and film and jazz throughout my entire career without realizing it. Just because they were sort of like early loves that have stayed with me. And so I actually reevaluate. I actually got a different take on my own career while putting together the book, of realizing how much that gave a kind of continuity to pieces that I didn't know that they had.
And I'm going to have to dig that out. I mean, I'm a huge Joyce fan, and Finnegan's Wake is a book I've been reading and rereading constantly for about 6 years, just sort of on a loop. every time I get to the end, I have to start again.
Well, the funny thing is, I've never even read all of it, but I feel like I don't even feel like I have to, To me, it's like something I bathe in, you
Yes.
know. I dip in and bathe in, and part of my argument when I'm writing about the jazz work of Godard is that it's actually my two favorite works by Joyce are Dubliners and Finnegan's Wake. To me, the problem with Ulysses, even though it's very brilliant and impressive, is that it's almost like more impressive as an accomplishment than as an experience for me, because there's so many. Whereas it seems to me, Ulysses is not something I can bathe in the way I can bathe in, roll around in Finnegan's Wake. And it's also, in a way, more universal, too, because, one interesting experience one might have is I don't know if you've ever heard Finnegan's Wake being read from aloud where children are present. They tend to giggle a lot. They really appreciate it. Kids can really get into it because at least my theory about it is that Finnegan's Wake sounds like the way the grown-ups sound when they talk, only funnier.
It's like the Charlie Brown experience of the grown-ups are just talking blah 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 blah.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to tell you the end of Finnegan's Wake, but basically it does just come back to the beginning again and start all over. So you could argue that anywhere in the book is the end. It's just wherever you stop reading.
That's right. Yeah. And I love that because I love the whole idea of open works in which that depend on the creativity of the audience. In other words, to me, part of the greatness, so much of the greatness of Wells is based on the way he uses the imagination of the viewer and the way he basically makes his audience collaborators, creative collaborators. And that's something I like to do too. Like, for example, one of the things that I'm most proudest of with that book, and Dreams Begin Responsibilities, is that I wanted to figure out a way of conveying on the cover of the book and the back cover what the book is about. And so what I did was, all right, in the front of the book are, you could say, rhyming images, which are images from 2001 and Playtime, which actually came out around the same time. And there's a piece in the book about the two films. But then on the back, I have rhyming images, one of which is Charlie Parker looking at Coleman Hawkins playing a solo. And this is an unfinished film that Jean Millet made that was never even finally finished. And then below that, the image that rhymes with it is perhaps the most famous image from Ivan the Terrible of Eisenstein. And to me, and what makes me proud of that is first, the whole idea of rhyme is literary. So that's the way I convey the idea of literature on the front cover and the back cover. But then, of course, you have jazz because you have Charlie Parker, and then you have film because all four of the images are from films. So it's like, and so it was a way in which I somehow felt that I could convey that essence through those juxtapositions of, images.
What would be some examples with Wells of him getting the viewer to participate for you?
Well, okay. I mean, in the camera movements book that I write, for example, okay, I can think of two camera movements in Wells' work, which are very mysterious and very emotional, but we have to analyze why they're effective as the way they are. One is there's the image of Charlie Kane as a little boy playing in the snow, and then the camera backing away from him, moving through the window where his mother is calling out to him. And the point is, as the image becomes wider and more inclusive, the future and the fate of the character becomes narrower and narrower because his whole future is being signed away during that sequence. Right. His mother is signing a contract where he's going to be taken away. So, all right, that's one. Then you have a camera movement that's very early in Mr. Arkadin when Guy Van Straten is sort of like hurrying up the steps that are on the outside of a building. And while he's doing that, the camera is pulling away from him. It's moving backwards. So we don't know what, but the point is what that conveys to me is a movement into the past, even though he's moving forward. What it conveys emotionally, because so much of the whole film is about delving into the past and sort of solving mysteries and so on. So it seems to me that those kind of, the point is that there are creative ways that we can deal with that, but we have to sort of like, both of those images require something from us. It's not simply they're not simply self-explanatory. And there's a great quote from Wells when he was still just a stage and radio director, when he said, "I just want to give an audience a hint of a scene, not the full hint of the scene, because that's when theater becomes a creative act when you have the audience working along with you." So I mean, he spelled it out even in the way he thought of what he was doing, and so much of what his the basically he what he felt his job was as a director was stimulating the imagination of the viewer in a
Mm,
certain way. And so I think it becomes almost logical that if you're doing part of the artist's work, then you become much more implicated in the work. Because you become more implicated, it's because I'm very much a believer is art is not a form of escape. It's a way of we should go to art and even to learn better how to live, in other words, that art is a way of improving our lives,
mm.
not a way of escaping from our lives, at least as I see it. And it literally is true for me in the sense that, for example, Playtime is a movie that I feel in very concrete ways enabled me to learn how to live in cities without being, I mean, when I was living in New York, one of the things that motivated me moving to Paris was that when I'd be walking down the street in New York, I would be, suffering from sensory overload. There were too many things to look at, to hear, to smell, and so on. And to me, Playtime literally shows you a methodology of how you can organize it all in your head and even make it funny in certain ways when you see the relationship of what's going on one side of the street to what's going on the other side of the street. There's a certain kind of creative way you can come to terms with it. And Playtime shows you how, I think. So I think that's my favorite example of a way that art can improve one's life. But there are many others, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. I think feel that films have had a huge influence in teaching me lessons which go from the very, very trivial to the deeply profound. I also wanted to ask you about you working on several Wells restorations, The Other Side of the Wind and
Yes.
Touch of Evil. Could you tell me a little bit about that work? Because
They
that
were not
was
really, either, I should say, are really restorations. To be
mm,
quite honest, in other words, restoring means putting things back to the way they were. And that wasn't what was done with either of those films. But it was trying to realize ideas of Wells that he expressed. I'm much happier with the experience of what happened with Touch of Evil, which I feel was a successful experience in all sorts of ways, even to the point that the re-edited Touch of Evil was an actual commercial success. So it's one of the only commercially successful release of a Wells film, at least in the U.S. Unfortunately, the trouble with The Other Side of the Wind, well, there are multiple. Part of it is that it's, okay, an unfinished film. It's really an anti-Hollywood film that was edited by 90% of the people who were making the final decisions on the editing were Hollywood people. So
mm,
they were following Hollywood protocols in what was an anti-Hollywood film. And I felt that lessened the power of it. I mean, there's specific sequences that were more powerful before the editors of The Other Side of the Wind got their hands on it. Like, because the Wells' own edit of the sequence, there's a gay baiting sequence in The Other Side of the Wind with John Huston and I can't remember the name of the actor, but he's an actor who's also plays the lead in The Fountain of Youth, the TV pilot Wells made. Anyway, the way Wells edited originally was a sequence that really made me squirm. I mean, it was sort of like it's just reverse angle of looks, of embarrassed looks between these two characters. But it really was kind of like uh, an excruciating. They decided to add an off-screen piano. Why? Because I guess there are other scenes in the house at the party that have an off-screen piano. But it seriously weakens the sequence. And when I was shown in this case, the rough cut, I said, you definitely shouldn't do that. You have to, and they wouldn't follow they basically felt that it was more important for some stupid continuity with other shots, to have that off-screen piano and making the scene much weaker. So I think that I generally feel that the music also that was done by Michel Legrand, even though the music he did in F for Fake is great, but of course Wells was guiding him and using him, the way he wanted it to. Whereas there was no, I think that both the quality of the music of Legrand and The Other Side of the Wind and the way it's used are terrible. So
Mm.
I generally think on the whole, the way that the soundtrack was treated weakened the film a lot. And what struck me is unbelievable. Wells believed, for example, on The Other Side of the Wind, that you have two blocks of material. You have the material of this party that's going on, and then you have the material of a film within the film. And he thought that the two blocks of material should have, be equal in terms of length, in terms of prominence, whereas almost everybody who worked on the film, including even Joe McBride, who's a real well expert, thought for commercial reasons that the party sequences should be more prominent and there should be more of those and less of the film within the film. So there was already a way in which they were betraying Wells' intentions for what
Mm.
they thought, you know. Well, I think one kind of term that we don't use in American culture, but we should use all the time is capitalist censorship, because I think it goes on all the time. And just following the argument that this is commercial, somehow there are all these things that you can't do. But I think that there's an awful lot of ways in which, but then there's also the other issues with The Other Side of the Wind that I think even if Wells, we can't even talk about Wells' intentions entirely because his intentions changed every day. I mean, he kept making changes, and so it's if even if we were restoring it to what he had in mind, because there was about, oh, I don't know, a fraction of the film that he'd already edited. But even there, they didn't follow everything. For example, there's a long sex scene in a car that he edited fully, and they cut it down for you know, the Netflix, for the version that was released. Also, let me just mention another thing that's a cause that I'm involved with, is that the only way that The Other Side of the Wind can ever come out on DVD is if Criterion chooses to bring it out because they have an exclusive deal with Netflix. They decided they're not doing it. Now, why they're not doing it, I don't understand, but there's been an awful lot of PC thinking at Criterion lately, but reflecting in the kind of things that they pick up for release. And I don't know if they rejected The Other Side of the Wind because of the fact that, I don't know, Oya Kodar plays a Native American. There might be other reasons. Maybe they just think, well, it's a bad film. But nobody, if it was PC, it's very short-sighted because Criterion brings out Touch of Evil, and Charlton Heston plays a Mexican, but nobody objects to that now, even though it's just as politically incorrect as Oya Kodar playing a Native American, I would think. So I think that there's a certain kind of way in which, I don't know, there are issues involving the film. I actually think the most important unseen Wells film is Don Quixote, not in
Mm.
the version released in Spain, which is worse than anything that was ever done to any of Wells' other films, actually. But of course, Oya Kodar unfortunately didn't know that Jesus Franco was, the biggest hack in European cinema, and was not. All she knew was that he was the assistant director on Chimes at Midnight, and she was. It was during the war between Serbia and Croatia, and she was trying to keep her parents alive and was desperate for money. So selling the rights to Spanish Expo was a way to keep her parents alive, and so she made a lot of decisions that she later regretted, in terms
Right.
of because she also remembered that Wells said, you know, that I have to discard all the material with Patty McCormick because we never could shoot enough of it, and so I have to redo it all with Beatrice. Well, he never did redo it with Beatrice, and all the best materials that I've seen from Don Quixote are the sequences with Patty McCormick. So the
Mm.
point is, any proper version that we should be allowed to see must include all that material. And in fact, I even posted one scene from it. I've seen a silent sequence in a movie theater on YouTube where anybody can access it. It was originally on Italian TV, late night TV, when Ciro Giorgini posted it in for some kind of late night TV show in Italy.
Like Cosa Mai
But that's
Visto.
anyway. That's just because without asking anybody's permission, I just sort of like showed it on a cable show, and so it wound up on YouTube.
I mean, there's so much Orson Welles that the Deep is one that never got out, and the Merchant of Venice is another. There just seems, and there's also the dream that one day a Magnificent Ambersons would turn up, and I mean, in a way, that's the Holy Grail.
We know the point is, I'm sad to say, yeah, except that I have to say, we know for a fact that Ambersons can't be found because there are even studio records of when they burnt their negatives. So, I mean, it's like even people who sort of go off to Brazil and get money from institutions saying to search down, it's all a kind of fantasy. It's not based on any kind of thing of reality because we know. And in fact, I even brought up the matter the one time I met Wells. I said, "Do you think there's any chance of finding the original cut?" He said, "No, no, no. I'm sure they burnt it all." So even I mean, I'm sure, and nobody suffered more because of its being burnt than he did. So I'm sure if he thought there was a slightest chance of it being retrieved, he would have retrieved it.
What was I mean, you've had relationships and friendships with filmmakers throughout your career, Jean-Luc Godard, Jim Jarmusch, and you met Wells when you were in Paris and had a friendship with him. What was your experience?
Well, there wasn't a friendship. Well, so just one meal. That's all.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I would be if I had lunch with Orson Welles. I would be saying we were blood brothers.
Well, I did say the first thing I said to him was that I was amazed that he invited me for lunch, and he said, "Well, it's because I didn't have time to answer your letter." But my being in his presence lasted for just an hour. But of course, I got to spend a lot of time with Oya. I mean, who's a friend, and I've been to visit many times at the Villa Wells, and so I've even been able to spend times with his library, the books that he had, because she still has all of, his books, for example. Not all of them, because there were probably some in Las Vegas, too, with his wife and daughter. But, it's, I feel that most of what I know about Wells came not from the hour I spent with him, although some of it came from that, but more from what I learned from some of the people he was closest to, because I got to spend lots of time with Gary Graver and Oya, both, and other people he worked with.
So we're coming to the end of our conversations. One last, a couple of final questions I want to squeeze in, if I may. One of the things that runs through the book that I thought was kind of funny. I was talking to Alyssa Wilkinson a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how there are no good feuds amongst critics anymore. And then reading your book, I was thinking, oh my God, there were so many feuds. There was such an atmosphere of arguing and people against people and everything.
Yeah, that's true.
It was kind of entertaining.
I was much more, well, I don't know, argumentative and feisty in some ways back then than I am now. But I certainly was penalized for it. What I gradually took me a long time to discover, for example, in New York, was that if you were writing in New York, it was okay to write something where you're basically insulting or dismissing the entire European left, everybody on the European left. But if you attack one colleague in New York, they won't speak to you. It's like you get right out of town. So it's like there are different rules for these things, it's like, I mean, I don't know, the reader can be the best judge of who was right or who was wrong in some of these battles, but I would say it did limit my choices when I was living in New York. And I feel ambivalent about it because, I miss New York in a lot of ways, and I have many more friends there than I do in Chicago and so on. But being a film critic in New York was impossible, for me at least.
But it seems like it was also the case in London, where there was a real factionalism between sight and sound and screen.
That's right. It's true. And I wasn't enough of an insider when I was in Paris for my position to be controversial. So I didn't have that problem when I during the 5 years I lived in Paris.
So you weren't Cahiers and versus Postif. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Michel Simon and say, oh, he's kind of obsessed with Cahiers and the competitiveness between the two. And I interviewed him a few years ago, and he spent a lot of time talking about how different he was from the people who wrote at Cahiers.
Well, I also point out, and that's something that's was and is very alarming to me, that my all-time favorite American film critic, Manny Farber, was very competitive too, with me. So, which totally ridiculous. I mean, it seemed to me that there is no logical way that you could ever consider him or me being in competition with each other. But he nonetheless regarded me that way, and maybe because he thought in sports terms. There's a theme that I talk about actually in this book, which is Jewish sibling rivalry. It's like that there's Manny Farber grew up with, I think he was the youngest of three brothers who were close in age to each other, who were all, very much competitive. And I grew up in a similar household. It's like with brothers who were close to the same age, and we were. And, I became very close to one of my brothers who died just a couple of years ago, the one who was 2 years younger than me. And we were both proud of the fact that we were able to overcome sibling rivalry and become very close. That we actually managed to, because it was like consciously combating, because there are certain ways in which, competitive sibling rivalry is something that is usually, it seems to me, unconsciously encouraged by the parents, because it's usually fighting one another to get the attention of the parent or the approval of the parent and so on. Anyway, I think it's an issue that a lifelong issue that I've had, and I think unfortunately it poisoned my relationship with Manny and prevented us from becoming good friends.
What about the younger generation of film critics that you see around these days, that you read these days? You mentioned that your former colleague David Kerr, you sort of say he's quite dispirited with the situation of film criticism, and you take a more optimistic point of view.
Yes. Well, I think, for example, we just had very different lives, in relationship to criticism. See, I would point to two online film magazines that were both co-edited by Adrian Martin. First, Rouge, and then Lola Journal, as being more sophisticated in terms of as film magazines than anything that ever came out on paper before that. And I think I could also cite Trafic as being, even though it was a quarterly, as a great, a really great film magazine that I was proud to be sort of a regular contributor to. And these are things that come after Trafic comes after the so-called golden age of film criticism, So I think the point is that there have been so many changes in how we watch film and how we write about them and so on, that I think people get confused by the fact that there's more criticism now because of the internet, and more bad criticism than before, but also more good film. In my opinion, more good film criticism than there was before. It's just you have to be motivated to go looking for it and to recognize it when it's, when you find it. But it seems to me that the big difference between Dave is he sees it all in apocalyptic terms, whereas I actually think, and but I have to say that there very subjective reasons for me being optimistic, because most of the people who read me online are young. I mean, when I can, on Google Analytics, I can follow who, sort of like I can gauge how many people, what the age groups are who go to my website the most. And it's quite almost systematically, the younger they are, the likelier it is they'll go to my website. Where people my own age are the ones who go to my website the least. So that's what makes me optimistic, because of the fact that I have that, it's like that I'm a cult writer, basically. And I've kind of come to not only accept, but appreciate that, because when you're a cult figure, it means that what you get from the people who like you is more intense, like, whereas if I was writing for the New Yorker, I would be much more famous, but I'd be famous because of the aura of the New Yorker. And and it wouldn't be as personal. It would be, it would be more impersonal. And as I've often mentioned, the one time I wrote something for the New York Times was, in retrospect, a pact with the devil. It's like I would never do it again. I think it was like a very unpleasant experience and I don't even like the piece that that they got me to write,
What
because
did you write for them?
what I wrote for them was when Ingmar Bergman died, I was invited by an editor on the op-ed page of the New York Times to write a dissenting view of Ingmar Bergman. Now I was willing to do that and happy to do that, but then it was, for one thing, is I wanted to say more good things about Bergman than the editor wanted. I wanted to acknowledge that, that by reputation, that he was a great theater director, and he wouldn't allow me to. In other words, I had to write his piece, not my piece, that it was negative. And I had to, so I had to rewrite it 2 or 3 times. The headline that was run with the piece, which is Scenes from an Overrated Career, was a stupid and offensive.
Yeah, I've read this piece, and it's it's one of those situations where I read the thing and I went, that headline doesn't match the article.
No, well, of course, but but that's standard, there's so many things that, in other words, they just wanted to get people's attention. But, I got more hate mail. And, I got more hate mail because of that title than because of my article, but it didn't matter because as far as the point is that it's almost like I'll be tarred and feathered forever because of that piece. And yet I don't even think it's mine. It's the New York Times. And in fact, it took me years before I was even willing to put it on my website.
Right.
And originally I would only put my original draft is on my website along with the published version because I think people can see the difference. Not that I'm that crazy about even the original piece, but anyway, that was it just made me realize that the way that there's always a trade-off, and that the larger your audience, the more compromised, at least for me, your work becomes.
I mean, all I can say is, in terms of being a cult author, I remember taking out your midnight movies from Barren Furnace Library a long time ago and devouring it. So you've definitely got a cult devotee here, although no longer in Barren Furnace. The final question I'd like to ask, I always ask for a film book recommendation, Jonathan. So if you'd like to give me a film book recommendation, any at all that our listeners might enjoy.
Okay, well, rather than mention, like Manny Farber's collected film criticism on Library of America, which I want to cite a film critic that's not widely enough read or appreciated, who's named Harry Allen Potamkin, who wrote mainly during the 20s and early 30s, who is also a poet, a communist, and, an American critic who, went to Europe in the 20s, interviewed Dreyer. I mean, who I think was a really interesting figure. He was also the first person who ever wrote about cult films, by the way. So there's a volume of all of his film criticism that came out years ago, which you could still track down. And so that's the one I would cite.
Excellent. That's a brilliant recommendation. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I would like to recommend Travels in the Cities of Cinema, Conversations with Ehsan Khoshbakht.
Great. Thanks.
It's been really fun talking to you.